Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Saturday. Let's talk about Loki's complicated family, specifically his children. He has been encouraging me to look at the myths through a variety of lenses, kind of turning them inside, outside, every which way to get a better understanding of them, and also to be less concerned with what was or wasn't literal, and just be a little bit more tuned to the symbolism and meaning, and trying to get myself more so in the psychological space that the myths represent. So let's begin with Sleipnir, the son of Loki via the infamous horse incident. One of Sleipnir's notable characteristics is that he had 8 legs, and this puts me in mind of the 8 spokes of the Wheel of the Year, the completion of the whole cycle. Now, another thing about Sleipnir is that does seem to be some disagreement about what size he was. Some say that he was just extraordinarily large and that his very hoof print could leave behind a canyon in its wake. And then other people say that Sleipnir was just kind of a bit bigger than your average horse. He just had 8 legs instead of the usual 4. Either way, Sleipnir left a mark on the landscape. If you saw him, you'd notice. This also establishes the precedent for the impact of all of Loki's children. If they're around, you notice. You notice their presence, you notice what they're up to. They don't just fade into the background like a wallflower. Sleipnir is known to be amazingly fast. He was considered to be the best of horses, and he had access to everywhere in the 9 realms. He could just go anywhere he liked, living or dead. And interestingly, in Norse mythology, horses were considered to be a liminal animal, so it wasn't just confined to Sleipnir, this ability to go hither and thither. So when I think about this capacity of Sleipnir, the words efficiency, excellence, and explore come to my mind. The idea of not dawdling when you have something to do it well, and have a sense of adventure, and try and see all that you can see. Now, sometimes I think of Sleipnir as almost a forgotten child of Loki. But when we look at him just with these few little details, we can see how he inherited Loki's spirit, even if we don't have any indication that Sleipnir inherited Loki's sentience. Now, one of the reasons why I think Sleipnir wasn't treated the way that his half-siblings were was because he was firmly under Odin's, and therefore the gods' control. This emphasis on control over trust, it points to very severe trust issues, and that trust wasn't going to be established. Oftentimes it wasn't even attempted to be established, and it was only through submitting to being controlled that you were going to be found acceptable. It's actually a very sad commentaries about what the state of affairs of relationships between the gods and Loki's and just each other, what things were at that time. So now let's look at Jormungandr, Fenrir, and Hel, who were all the product of Loki's relationships with Angrboda. So first, Jormungandr. He's described as a serpent, occasionally as a dragon, and he was thrown to Midgard when he was just a baby because he was deemed to be a threat to the gods. He was cast into the ocean and has since grown to encircle the entire earth. In fact, there are some legends that say that whenever he's moving around and shifting it, it can actually cause earthquakes. So interesting point of mythology there. Now, snakes in paganism, they don't really have a particularly bad rap. Oftentimes, snakes are symbols of fertility, of reincarnation, transformation, even radical healing, as well as, the general acknowledgement that the venom of some of these snakes is wildly dangerous and even lethal. But snakes represent the whole cycle of life and death and the possibility of what comes beyond. It is more about the fertility and the transformation than anything that's considered to be detrimental. So it's interesting that Jormungandr is so immediately cast into the role of the villain. Now, as we are aware, we touched on Jormungandr, he grew to immense proportions. And it puts me in mind of how problems grow. And I'm making this comparison because, the gods saw him as a problem. So let's think of it through those terms. He was cast into the sea when he was very small. And we oftentimes have problems that we think are small. It can be dealt with later. We'll ignore it. But while we're ignoring it, it grows. And the next thing you know, the problem has become overwhelming, just as Jormungandr eventually became quite overwhelming to the gods. But his story is also about a lesson in survival. We may feel very small. We may find ourselves isolated or thrown into an environment we're not used to, but we can adapt. We can survive. We can grow. And that capability and that kind of adaptation of just not surrendering and not shriveling up, it can be very frightening to people who would prefer that we wither away. And sadly, there are some people out there who have incredibly mean spirits who do wish various individuals and groups of individuals ill, but we don't have to accommodate them. This brings us to Fenrir. Fenrir is a giant wolf. Even when he was born, he was already quite large, and it wasn't very long before his physical power was evident for everyone to see. He also possesses the power of unlimited growth, and this is really what led to him having trouble with the gods. In a similar fashion, someone who is just naturally powerful. Some people just have that kind of charisma, that kind of natural leadership, or they are seen by others as just being this unstoppable force. Anyone who's in that general category of being, they're going to be distrusted. There's always going to be someone who's very suspicious of them, someone who just does not like the fact that they're not on the leash that everyone else seems to be on. Interestingly, when Fenrir achieved adolescence, he had actually reached a size where that if he was drooling or there was any foam in its mouth, it would actually form a river. Now, this was a very interesting thing for me because rivers are composed of water, and as I've covered in other videos, water represents emotion. Feelings can be immensely powerful, and the idea of a formation of a river representing Fenrir's emotions, I think that says something about just the raw power that was churning within him and just how emotionally driven he really was. Now, ultimately, the gods did decide to bind Fenrir because they saw him as a present and a future danger to themselves, especially given the prophecies of what Fenrir was said to do during Ragnarok. However, the actions that they took against him to bind him made that outcome inevitable. It has been said by many that you can't force someone to be your friend, but you can definitely force them to become your enemy. And the binding of Fenrir was really that final nail in the coffin, because by the time the binding is broken, Fenrir has had who knows how long to brood about what's occurred. And during that course of time, of course, that was the end of empathy, the end of mercy, the end of a possibility of reconciliation. And all that was left was blind rage and a thirst for revenge. What makes this even worse is that wolves, as we know, are pack animals, and to be rejected by the pack is extremely traumatic. Even for human beings, the threat of being ostracized can be almost worse than death for some people. It cuts relationships ties, and most people can't begin to cope with it. It's why cancel culture is so successful. People will literally go insane if they think they're going to lose their connections with everyone around them. And that tendency is mirrored in Fenrir's story because he was rejected by his pack. So let's talk about Hel. Hel has the distinction of being Loki's only daughter, and her appearance is described as being someone who is half dead, half living girl, half corpse. And it seems to have a variety of opinions about how exactly her form divided, whether it's on the horizontal, she's one side's here, one side's there, or if it's more vertical, normal here, dead below. And other times she's described as having a body that's half white and half black in the color sense of the terms, not the skin pigmentation of the terms. And her facial expression is said to be severe and unsympathetic and fierce. And there's even disagreement as to whether her appearance is literally how she looks or if it's a deliberate illusion on her part. And of course, the foundation for that question really comes from Loki's capacity as a shapeshifter. It doesn't seem too unreasonable to imagine that at least some of his children might have inherited that capability. But regardless, the way Hel is presented, looking neither living nor dead and being in some kind of in-between state, this is worth our contemplation. Because even when we are alive, our physical forms are gradually deteriorating, bringing us closer to the state of physical death. And when we die and we exist only as our spirit form, eventually we get closer and closer to the point where we are reincarnated and take on the flesh once more. In a way, we are just as in between as Hel is, whether we're on this side of the veil or on the other side. And this makes her, I think, relatable in a kind of a weird way. Even though this commonality we have with her, it's not necessarily the most comfortable thing to contemplate. Now, because her facial expression is reportedly grim and uncompromising, I'm inclined to think that this has more to do with the nature of death and her role in presiding over Helheim. Death, physical mortality, it doesn't negotiate. It doesn't respond to fear or favor. It takes place regardless of what we do. And when our current incarnation ends, that's final. That's it for that particular body. It's done. And the sense of physical death being permanent in that way is actually related to the lesson we can glean from the death of Balder. Dead is dead. Our spirit can be reborn, but when the flesh goes, the flesh is gone. Now, personality-wise, some people view hell as being indifferent or cold, even cruel, and I'm just not convinced that's really fair or accurate. Just take into account the role that she plays when she's ruling the underworld and the reality of mortality that she just deals with on a constant basis. That is the sum total of her existence. Of all the gods, she's probably the most grounded, no pun intended, because she has to accept what is, the reality of what is, all the time. Is she unsympathetic for this? Does her attitude reflect the reality of existence and the reality of her job? And because part of her job is to enable us to accept that core reality as well. It's something to think about. Another possibility about why people take a dim view of her on the more personal level is maybe she's an INTJ, not the most friendly of all of the tribes. If you're familiar with the MBTI personality classification, it's a thought that just occurred to me. If you're familiar with MBTI, read up on the descriptions of INTJ and compare it with hell, and let me know what you think about that particular idea. So let's talk about Vali and Narfi, who were born of the union of Loki and Sigyn. We'll begin with Vali. Now, there is some debate whether Vali was the son of Loki or the son of Odin, or if the brother of Narfi was actually called Narvi. So for the purpose of this video, I will be using the name Vali. So apart from the role this particular son of Loki played in the binding of the cave, nothing is really known about him. But what we do know is that Vali was transformed into a wolf, and then he tore his brother Narfi to pieces, and then Narfi's guts were used to tie his father to a rock, thus binding him. Now, as we mentioned earlier, wolves are pack animals, and pack animals, of course, can recognize their own pack. So when Vali couldn't recognize his family, his pack as being his own, this indicates to me that Vali was driven to a rabid state of madness, or that magic was used to force him to be violent even when he was consciously aware, which, wouldn't that be so much more awful? The idea of an external force breaking someone to such an extent that they would lose their identity, their agency, and even their memory of who their loved ones are is absolutely terrifying. Now, the myths don't comment if Vali ever reverted to his true form or became conscious of what he'd done. But, just imagine waking up to that nightmare and knowing there was nothing you could do at that point. We have been experiencing some unprecedented forms of stress in the past few years, and there's undoubtedly more of that to come. We are watching our neighbors go through breakdowns. Perhaps we're even experiencing that to a certain degree ourselves. So how many people have found themselves to be in this wolf-like state of mind like Vali was? And all we want to do is lash out, and our emotions are out of control, and we end up doing serious damage to our relationships and to our own well-being. This is another one of those uncomfortable points of comparison and commonality, but I think it's something worth wrestling with, especially considering what we're dealing with in the here and now. Now, Narfi. Narfi was essentially a sacrifice. He was a means to an end to punish his father. And as mentioned, his brother was turned into a wolf, and then Narfi died that brutal death. And then, as if that wasn't enough, his entrails were used as a rope to tie his father down for perpetual torture, thanks to the venom of a snake dripping down onto him. It isn't stated how old Vali and Narfi were at the time of these events. There is some suggestion that they had both reached adult age, and the prose edit does mention Narfi being the father of Nod. What isn't clear is this the same Narfi who was the Narfi son of Loki, or is it someone else who just happens to also be called Narfi? Not too sure. But just the idea of being reduced to a tool that's used to hurt someone else is extremely degraded. It's bad enough to be executed for not because of anything you've done. The execution's not even about you, but to be executed so that you can be used to further punish someone else. That's a truly awful, awful fate. It was a horrific death. And the legacy and all that was left behind of Narfi is just that he was used as a further method of torture. Because remember, death wasn't the end for him. His own innards were used as a perpetual reminder, not only of his death, but of the punishment that his death was meant to inflict. This reminds me of when people find themselves caught in the midst of a struggle between two other people, and then being used as a weapon against, one or both parties. One example of this is when children are used as bargaining chips when their parents divorce, or when someone is dating someone else to get back at their ex or to make someone jealous, or when politicians impose policies that hurt people and then try to convince the public that it was the opposition's fault and they didn't do it, and then they attempt to leverage the pain and suffering of the public to gain more money, power, and control. Absolute brutality using other people in this fashion. So there's a lot to unpack when we contemplate Loki's children, and of course we just scratched the surface here. I'm sure at some point we will revisit it. I didn't want to get too much into it today because we were in some pretty gloomy territory, but it's okay that we were. Spirituality isn't only about the aspects of life and divinity that we're comfortable with, but it's also about helping us find a way to understand the things we aren't comfortable with, including the nature of suffering and the consequences of inflicting suffering onto other human beings. It's also worth noting that it's not without reason that the threat of Ragnarok doesn't loom large in the myths until after Loki's children come into the scene, and then they have their awful experiences with the gods. I've heard plenty of parents say that they don't mind so much what happens to them, but mess with their children, and there's going to be a big problem. Food for thought, especially in the context of what brings Ragnarok about. So, despite that, I hope you were able to glean something useful from this video and that it got you to thinking a little bit. If you'd like to discuss this or any other topics related to paganism or witchcraft, please come visit me at Blackbird's Brew on Discord. There's a link to join in the description box below. And in the meantime, please subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.